Good afternoon, everybody. If I could have your attention, please. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Robin Shepherd, and I'll be moderating this session. I'd like you to welcome our delegation from the United States Senate, which is coming into the room right now. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for coming back for this session. It wasn't easy to make it, given the guests we've got. It's sometimes a hard sell. Isn't that right, Senator McCain? You have trouble drawing an audience. But everybody managed to come, and even managed to come on time. I'll introduce the senators first, and then make a few opening remarks, and then we'll get straight in to the questions. I should say the senators have just come back from Kiev. There's a kind of inevitability that this discussion is going to tend towards Ukraine, given that it's not only a vital matter in its own right, it's also symbolic of far bigger issues at play in the world. The senator immediately to my left is, of course, Senator John McCain, who is chairman of the Committee on the Armed Services of the United States Senate. He's a senator from Arizona. Next to him is John Barrasso, a member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate, and I believe from Wyoming. And next to him, on the far end of our panel, is Senator Tom Cotton, who's also a member of the Armed Services Committee of the United States and comes from Arkansas. That was going to be the toughest bit for me, to get the right states, so I think I just got that one right. So the discussion that we're having today is entitled US Foreign Policy Still a European Power. I think anybody who confronts the question of transatlantic relations at some point has come across the paradox at the heart of it right at the beginning, that the United States was formed in opposition to Europe, and yet was formed on the basis of core European values, those of classical liberalism, and those were the values that informed the thinking of the founding fathers. But while the core values endure, and we do talk consistently about an alliance of values, the way in which the relationship is understood by both sides often changes. And I was struck, when I was thinking about this panel, about some of the milestones that we've seen. We saw in 1999 the expansion of NATO to bring in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. We saw some problems in the early part of the 2000s in terms of the relationship. But now the question is, where do we actually stand? So Senator McCain, how would you evaluate the broader relationship?
I think the fundamentals of our relationship are strong. I think that one of the great achievements of modern history was the defeat of the then Soviet Union without conflict, that a steadfast and solid alliance against the then Soviet Union was one of the great achievements, since no blood was shed. I think that it is now under a kind of strain and pressure that it has obviously not been since the end of the Cold War. And frankly, I have found our response, European and the United States response, to Vladimir Putin's aggression, absorbing parts of a sovereign nation in Europe for the first time in 70 years, a challenge that I do not believe that either the European community or the United States has risen to. And if you look at what Vladimir Putin has been able to accomplish versus the price that he has paid for it, I think you have to conclude that Vladimir Putin is doing pretty well, even if he sanctioned me.
Senator Barrasso, how do you see things? I mean, how perhaps you can give us a sense of how not just the political classes, but also the American public views Europe. I mean, are we viewed as being a great asset? Are we viewed as being potentially something which could do a lot better? One argument that was put to me by a friend in the United States was that it's possible that Europe's inability to potentially step up to the plate in the way Americans would like has even contributed to isolationism in the Republican Party, a certain sense that, look, even Europe won't stand with us, so we might as well just stand alone. Does that resonate with you anyway?
Well, Robin, I think what you're saying will resonate with different parts of the Republican Party, and some are more isolationist, some more saying even to be more involved in this relationship, which I think is very strong. I think in terms of my recent travels to a number of NATO nations, it's, as in real estate, location, location, location. Everyone wants a stronger relationship, but the question is depending on where you sit. If you go and visit Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, that focuses specifically against Russia. When you're in some of the southern countries who are members of NATO, they're more focused on ISIS and what's happening in North Africa now. So everyone seems to be wants a more robust NATO, and I believe that we should be much more involved in generating that, with the United States being a major contributor. Also, we ask the countries that we visit, are they making the 2% that we're asking them to contribute as well, because we know the importance of Article 5, which is the attack against one is an attack against all, but there are also other articles that have to do with the countries must take care of itself. So there is at a point where the United States, with a large debt, says, can we continue to afford to do what we need to do at home as well as abroad? So you're right, there is some component of isolationism, but the bigger component to me is we cannot allow Vladimir Putin to continue to do what he is doing with this kind of aggression. He will not stop.
So ultimately, even if the United States has a certain sense of disappointment that Europe might not be, well, certainly in the case you mentioned, and it's something that's been discussed in this conference, stepping up in terms of defense expenditure, the geopolitical stakes are so high that the United States is not simply going to disengage and say, all right, it's your problem, not ours.
That's correct, and I'd like to see the administration doing more right now in terms of defensive weapons for Ukraine. We've just returned from Ukraine. We've been there the last 2 days, both in eastern Ukraine as well as in Kyiv, and know how important it is that all of us stand behind our friends there.
Senator Cotton, as one of the, I think, is it you possibly the youngest member of the United States Senate?
I am, but that's a pretty easy bar to clear.
I wonder then whether, if you don't mind me putting...
He's not the shyest.
Okay.
I learned it from Senator McCain.
Well, it's a good thing you're not shy, because I've given you the opportunity to prove that with this question then. Is there, and I hope you don't mind me putting it this way, or any of you mind putting it this way, is there a generational view that you see? I mean, Republicans of your generation, do they take a tougher view on Europe in terms of Europe's responsibilities as an ally, or is there some sort of muscle memory there in United States political culture which believes that the transatlantic relationship is absolutely vital, and that Europe can in fact be brought round, whatever problems there might be, and of course Europeans see problems in the United States, but from your perspective looking over here, what do you think, and you and your colleagues, what do you talk about in private? How do you talk about Europe? Is it positive, or is it somewhat scathing sometimes?
Well, in my generation, as in John and John's generation, our grandparents' generation, we still view America as an Atlantic and European country. We always will be, by dint of history, tradition, trade, security. That's a simple fact. I'm not the only new senator in the United States Senate from my generation. Younger senators like Joni Ernst and Dan Sullivan share the view, and the importance that we remain engaged in Europe because Europe is always going to be most secure and most prosperous when the United States is helping lead in Europe. And one reason why we wanted to go to Ukraine on this trip and then come here is to promote the concept that Europe must remain whole, free, and secure. And the way we do that is to maintain the unity in the Atlantic Alliance. We've seen the same games that Vladimir Putin has been playing for the last 18 months in Ukraine and in the EU and NATO that we saw throughout the Cold War, trying to divide the West one by one to promote his interests in the region. It's so critical that we not allow that to happen. Whether it's his funding of radical nationalist parties, invading a sovereign country, or just the rhetoric that he employs, that the world, and therefore America, cannot be safe unless the United States and Europe are united, and Europe is whole, free, and secure.
Could I point out
Please.
that Senator Cotton, and he mentioned Senator Ernst, Senator Sullivan, there are others that are coming into the Senate and the House who have had experience in Iraq and Afghanistan with a military background. It's been very helpful for the environment, for the debate, and for the input that they bring as combat veterans to our discussions, and it's been extremely helpful.
Just coming back to a question about Europe, there's also the question of, how we define that space over which there's so much conflict right at the moment. I mean, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia is a little bit further over, but do you believe that Europe and NATO may have missed a trick 5-10 years ago in not giving these countries themselves a clear path to be part of a community which, in terms of values, we want to defend? I mean, should we have expanded NATO and the EU more aggressively in order to try and obviate some of the problems which we're now having to deal with?
I believe we should have, and at the time I urged that it happen. Decision was made, particularly in regards to Ukraine, and there were internal problems in Ukraine as well. By the way, they missed a golden opportunity because of the divisions within the new government after they gained control. But I think that was one of the mistakes. But
And
I
is
think
it too late to rectify?
I think it could be corrected.
It could.
I do. But I'm also very concerned about the contributions that many of the NATO members do not make. It is irritating to my constituents when I tell them how much we spend on defense and on our alliance, and then they find out that other members of NATO are minuscule contributions. But having said that, I agree with Tom. There is strong allegiance to Europe amongst my constituents, but I can also say again, majority of the Congress, just day before yesterday, the Senate voted unanimously to provide defensive weapons to Ukraine. The same thing happened in the House of Representatives. We cannot force the President to do that, but we can certainly express the overwhelming and strong will of the people we represent. And could I just finally say, there is a different attitude John was talking about. When Americans saw other Americans being beheaded, it had a significant effect, and understandably, on American public opinion. We saw a 40-point shift. This election, this presidential election, will have more to do with foreign policy and national security than any election in the United States since 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected. So these issues and our relations with Europe matter a great deal, more so than any time in the past amongst my constituents.
And with that in mind, but also just to come back, and I want to bring in the other senators as well in a second, there's the stakes are very high right now, and that point about the situation could be rectified with regard to NATO and European Union membership. Are you calling for NATO and the EU to actively, not just consider, but to get down to the business of inviting Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia into those structures?
Well, obviously, I would rule out Belarus immediately. Yeah, there are certain criteria, obviously, for being members. One of them is democracy, a democratic government. But I certainly think that at least we could put them on the path. As you know, there are certain criteria they have to meet before they're eligible for membership. I would certainly encourage them to embark on that path, and then to see how they're doing as to when the final decision would be made.
And Senator Barrasso, same sort of question. Do you believe that within the American Senate, there is, amongst all the other issues that senators deal with, I mean, you deal with foreign relations and armed forces and all the related issues, that there is the political will very difficult to change White House policy in the last year or two of the presidency, but to set the groundwork for a new beginning, whoever wins the presidency in 2000.
Well, I think there is that opportunity, and I'm working in a bipartisan way to set a groundwork for more export of American energy. Because if you think about what can help all of those countries, it's less dependence on Russia for energy. We have a plan to do that. We have bipartisan support. We have a significant abundance of energy. You had a forum earlier, a discussion on energy. But so much of it has to do with just the breakthrough in technology in the last 10 years with an ability to provide more energy. America is, I believe, can be the energy power of the world, and we ought to be using that as an instrument of our strength and power to help our European allies become less dependent on energy from Russia. Obviously, Vladimir Putin uses energy as a club, as a weapon to keep many people at bay. He has, I think, so many European nations that receive such a high percentage of their energy from Russia, then they're much less willing to do the right thing, in my opinion, with regard to additional sanctions, not just maintaining sanctions, but additional sanctions to put Putin, push him back from what he's been doing in Ukraine and other areas. So that's what I'm working on in the Senate, as someone from an energy state on the Energy Committee, working together, both sides, so that no matter who is president, we can be providing that sort of unifying support and freedom. I mean, freedom comes from energy. When you think about freedom, you think about economic freedom, and energy security is a very significant part of economic security, and then national security, and that's where I'm pushing.
Right. There's a related question just before I come out to the audience. One of the big existential issues, and it does rise to that level right at the moment, along with Ukraine, is of course the Greek crisis. And in a sense, both of these crises have converged in the way that the Russians have, obviously with a view to stirring the geopolitical pot, have said that they will, or have said that they will consider helping with a bailout for Greece, because if they could get the prize of a European Union country, however fantastical it might have sounded 2 or 3 years ago, this changes the whole chessboard. I mean, do you, and I'll give to both other senators the same question, do you think that this is something that is in any way opportunistic, or do you think that this is just pie in the sky and it's scaremongering and we shouldn't be too worried?
That Putin is opportunistic and aggressive, and he will look for any chink in the armor, anywhere he will be probing, and then will penetrate wherever he gets an opportunity, and whether that's energy, whether that's economic, depending on the country, the location, any sign of weakness, he sees it, and he's going to continue to move in that direction. It's just the way that he is acting, and I think we have to be able to stand and resist.
Senator Cotton, the same question. Do you see that danger from Putin being, as Senator Barrasso put it, being opportunistic? That, Angela Merkel said today that she needs a deal to be ready to be decided upon tomorrow. Does it resonate, that point about the convergence between the geopolitical and the global financial crisis, which has found its location in Greece, that Putin is trying to stir the pot down there? Is that part of the conversation in Washington, D.C.?
Well, it certainly strikes me as one specific example of the general challenge I cited earlier of Russia trying to divide the West. Obviously, Ukraine is one, and then support for various parties throughout Europe is another. But now this kind of last-minute showman-like intervention in Greece is yet another. There's, putting aside the momentary question, there's more than enough blame to go around Athens, Berlin, Paris, and Washington for getting the point to where we are now. But it is one specific instance of the way that Russia is playing the West against each other that we saw throughout the Cold War, and by and large were able to overcome, which is why we won the Cold War. Didn't end in a tie. It wasn't even a close game. We won it, and they lost it. And we need that kind of unity to confront Putin again, not just in the geopolitical and military challenges in countries like Ukraine, but in the financial challenges we face in countries like Greece and elsewhere.
Do you believe,
Could I just add
yes,
one other dimension of this that is very important, of course, is the very successful cyber activity and propaganda activities that Vladimir Putin has orchestrated, the inundation of the Baltics and other countries with information, with propaganda. The cyber security aspect is really something important we have seen hacking in the last couple of weeks that could have violated the privacy of at least 4 million Americans. Whether it came from Russia or China, that's obviously not the point. But they continue to attack using cyber, but they also continue to succeed, and particularly in their Russian-speaking populations in the Baltics and other places. One of the reasons why we won the Cold War was Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and our message that penetrated the Iron Curtain. We collectively have to counter these both cyber warfare, but also the propaganda warfare that Vladimir Putin has been giving some credit. It's been effective.
It's fascinating. I said on the side before I come to the audience, this kind of conference is, of course, very closely watched in Moscow, and they have set up their own thing. And since yourself and Senator Barrasso also come to the Halifax International Security Forum, I don't know whether you know, but you'll be interested to know, the Chinese government have set up a rival security forum in Xinjiang on exactly the same day. Exactly the same day.
I think we'll have a tough decision as to which to attend.
Conferences of values, Senator McCain.
Yeah. But, you know, as I mentioned, I was sanctioned by Vladimir Putin, and it was recently reported in Russia that I was dead. Hello, I'm still hanging on. Anyway.
Good to hear it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for you to ask questions. I could think of plenty more, but this is an expert audience. And so I'd like to remind you to wait for the microphone to come to you, say who you are, and make your questions as brief as you possibly can. The gentleman over there was the first I saw. Over that side of the auditorium.
Thank you very much. This microphone is confusing. I would like to ask the honorary censors, how do they evaluate the cooperation of their country with their key European allies these past few years, especially in the face of the security crisis that the European Union and their allies face in what we call the wider European neighborhood, especially in the face of the crisis that we call the Levant crisis, which started with the Syrian civil war. After the 2011 intervention in Libya, which was led by the United States and later by NATO and an international coalition, the United States was widely criticized for not intervening in Syria and for this crisis to succumbing to the Syrian and the Iraqi state into a state of near state failure. I would like to ask you, how do you see a way for the United States and the United States key allies to cooperate to face this crisis? I mean, the United States has a whole 6th fleet in the Mediterranean and military bases in the region.
It's a great question, but do you mind?
Thank you too much. I'm really sorry.
No, the question's very clear. It's all done. Thank you. Have the microphone down here, please.
Pauline Neville-Jones, UK. Can I just say how good it is to see a Senate delegation in Europe? The question I wanted to ask you relates to a debate that we've been having in previous sessions, where there's been something of underlying, not disagreement, but certainly range of views on the subject of how bold we think the Russians will be in the light of their experience in Ukraine, where, as Senator McCain rightly said, you know, they've got quite a lot out of it, including Crimea, but it hasn't been a perfect experiment. And there are some losses, and I believe actually there's some further losses in the future for them, which haven't yet eventuated. But my question really is, do you think that in the light of what we've seen and what we know about this man, that he's likely to engage in further militarily related confrontation, particularly, you know, begin to poke around in the borders of NATO? Or do you think that he will do something else? And here I never thought I'd have to use this word again because it relates to the Cold War, engage in wedge driving, just as, you know, potentially we see with Greece, combined with hybrid activity, propaganda, undermining the soft underbelly of Europe, which I think remains the Balkans. He has plenty of scope of a non-military kind to create real trouble for us over time. And I'd be interested to know where you think his tactics are likely to lie.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you. And one more here before we start another round.
Jonathan Isle, also from the UK. You put very clearly, all of you, the position of the Senate and of the House about where you think the United States should stand on the Ukraine conflict. But you also pointed out that you can't really tell the president, or there are limits to how much you can tell the president what to do. So where do you think the White House is going on this in the lead up to the Warsaw NATO summit? And do you think that this debate will get enmeshed into the separate debate about a potential Ukrainian deal?
Okay, well, so you have that question, a question on how bold we think Russia will be, and also the first question, which was on the crisis in the Levant, Syria intervention, and so on. Senators, either answer all or one of them, entirely up to you, or two of them even. Should we start over with Senator Cotton, please?
Sure. You know, one underlying premise of the questions here from the audience, as well from Robert, is kind of the whither NATO question, the whither EU question. And there is a bit of a sense in America and Europe that things are not going our way lately. That's understandable given the state of our economy and given the security situation we face. But we should also think about all the things we have going in our favor, specifically as it relates to Russia. We still have military dominance when you look at the NATO military combined. We still have unrivaled prosperity, over half of the world's GDP. And we have, maybe most importantly, political legitimacy. Democratic capitalist governments that are responsive to their peoples and that are attractive to countries all around the world. We should always keep that in mind when we think about the kind of situation we face, as well as the kind of cooperation that the United States and Europe give to each other. As it relates to Vladimir Putin and his boldness, there's not a question of whether he will conduct future military operations. He is conducting them at this very moment. There are dozens of attacks on the line of control in eastern Ukraine every single day. You don't have to think that he's going to have some kind of dramatic assault to take Mariupol, for instance, or to build a land bridge to Crimea, to realize he's going to go bit by bit by bit, making the area under his control in eastern Ukraine more economically coherent by getting water and power resources and so forth. And if the West doesn't do something to stop him there, then I think there is a chance that we'll have to stop him in the Baltics, or that he'll put the same kind of cruise missiles or the same kind of coastal defense systems in Kaliningrad that he's putting in Crimea, trying to turn the Black Sea into his lake, just like he would try to turn the Baltic Sea into his lake as well. That's why it's so important that the West draw the line in Ukraine, not just militarily, but from an economic and political standpoint as well, to show not just the people of Ukraine, but the people of Russia, that the path of countries like Slovakia and Poland and the Czech Republic is the path that they want to take, not the path of Vladimir Putin.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, and to Pauline's point, I think he's going to get very bold on this, as long as he is not stopped, as the Prime Minister today told us in Kiev, that he said, he thinks that Putin is like a dog who senses fear. He doesn't want to become your friend. He just goes after where the fear exists. And I think that's exactly what he's going to keep doing. But if you just look, and I think Misha's here from Georgia, who's now in Odessa, the weaponry, the technology, the fighting ability of the Russians then compared to now, it's a quantum leap of improvement. And I think this is maybe just a training ground of what he's doing in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, for the next step. The asymmetric of the hybrid warfare is dramatic. And energy is a significant part of that, with the dominance of energy and the reliance of others on that energy. He's going to continue to use that in addition to the misinformation, the cyber, the propaganda, and we need to stand up and get back with the message in the other direction, but in Russian. I mean, he's doing a marvelous job with RT, Russian television, and well, you're very familiar with what he's doing there. So I think that he is the #1 force and concern worldwide right now. Certainly ISIS is a threat, but when you look at their capacity to do damage as opposed to the brutality of it, but the capacity is nothing compared to what the thug, the bully, Putin has. Iran as a future threat? Yes, if they get nuclear weapons and the threat there, then then they will become not just a military power, an industrial power, a nuclear power as well, more of a potential threat. But Putin is the threat today, and I think to all of us.
I think that we pretty well concluded that Vladimir Putin is a thug and a bully, and he will do what bullies do, and that is whatever he can get away with. I want to go back just for a minute to the first question, the Middle East. Right now, Iran is in control in 4 countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and now Yemen. And we just found out that Iran is supplying weapons to the Taliban in Afghanistan as we continue withdrawal, despite indications on the ground that we will see the Iraq movie again in Afghanistan if we don't leave a force behind would stabilize the country. When the red line was crossed that the president drew and we didn't act, that had a profound effect all over the Middle East. It's not a secret that the Saudis had aircraft on the runway ready to strike, and they found out that we weren't going to on CNN. I had the foreign minister of a Gulf state recently said, we believe it may be better to be America's enemy than its friend. And have no doubt that the Iranians continue on the move, and ISIS continues to pose a threat that is attracting young men from every country in this room to its banner. And those young men, and even a few young women, someday are going to return to the country that they came from, radicalized, better trained, and better capable of launching attacks on the countries that they have returned to. So we don't have a strategy in the Middle East. The president 3 or 4 days ago said, we haven't developed a strategy yet. I could give you many examples of the fact that we don't have a strategy, particularly when we're talking about Syria. So we're going to have to develop a strategy. We're going to have to rely to some degree on the Peshmerga as the only real viable fighting force at the moment. But the Peshmerga are not the ones who can ultimately solve the problem, because they are not Iraqis. And we are going to have a massive challenge in trying to rebuild the Iraqi military. And right now, unfortunately, those that are doing the fighting are the Shia militia, the same ones that we fought against during the surge. That's a great tragedy. Finally, I was campaigning for one of my colleagues. We were at a veterans event. A young man came up to me and said, Senator McCain, I was at the Second Battle of Fallujah. I lost 86 of my colleagues, 3 in my platoon. He said, now the black flags of ISIS fly over Fallujah. He said, tell me, Senator McCain, what do I tell their mothers? You know, I don't have a good answer for that. Finally, on Libya, if we'd have walked away from Europe after World War II, I predict to you that Europe would not be what it is today. If we had walked away from Japan, if we had walked away from Korea, we still have 38,000 American troops there. We killed Gaddafi and we walked away. And so the results were largely predictable, since we did not do what was necessary, and it was a list of about 10 things that would have been able to secure at least a stable situation there rather than what it is today. I'm sorry for the long answer.
No, it's fascinating. I think that point that we, in terms of the commitments we make, it depends on the expectations we have for the people and the values we want them to live by and what we believe they deserve. And it's an interesting point that after the Second World War, Europe and Japan, the United States felt, hold on, these people can be brought up to a decent level, whereas perhaps we don't see things quite that way. There's some sort of disconnect in the way we approach some countries in the world, and we simply don't believe, I put it to you, that they're worthy of the values that we believe we should be taking for granted ourselves.
And again, I would point Korea as another example. That country was devastated by the fighting that went back and forth across that peninsula, and look at what it is today. It's what you can do. And Korea never known any democracy before, by the way. So I think we are ignoring some of the lessons of history, and we're paying a price.
Thank you. More questions? Sorry, did you want to say something?
I would just say, too, that the point that Senator McCain made about the red line and how devastating that was for our credibility, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. I think one reason why Vladimir Putin thought he could invade Ukraine is because of what happened with the red line. One reason why China thought it could accelerate its land reclamation projects in the South China Sea is the red line. We hear that from leaders of countries all around the world, not simply in the Middle East. But that was characterized as kind of an off-the-cuff, impromptu remark after the fact. Article 5 is the clearest, most formal, most ironclad red line that a country can draw in the world. And if we don't stop Vladimir Putin in Ukraine and little green men show up in a country like Estonia and Latvia, we will have a choice between war with Russia or the obsolescence of NATO. That is not a choice that we should want to face.
Thank you very much. There was a question I saw from a gentleman over there. Where is the gentleman? Can't see him anymore. Or I guess there he is, sorry, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Karimi from Iran. Thank you, Senators. There is a school of thought within the Europeans that they can accommodate a kind of collective security arrangement with Russia. Is United States could be a part of that arrangement? And regarding to my region, I come from the Middle East, as Senator McCain indicated, lack of strategy by US government is the problem causing trouble in the Middle East. Because presidents, they come with doctrine, and when they go, the doctrine is gone, another president you have. Sometimes they support Daesh, ISIL, and sometimes they bomb them. So this is a kind of confused foreign policy, accusing Iran, but at the same time accommodating Iranian cooperation in Afghanistan, which we have done in the past. So I think US should be thinking to be part of the solution rather the problems as we are facing in the Middle East. The outcome, the ISIL, is the wrong policies of the United States during the Bush administration. So I think it is better for the future to accept the regional, arrangement to be in kind of cohabitation with other countries in other regions, because they have been civilized, they have civilization, they have empires in the past. So US has to be part of the solution rather than the problem. Thank you.
Thanks. Gentleman there, please, yes.
Thank you very much. Benjamin Haute Couverture, Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris. Senator, can we come back just a few minutes on Iran, and not because of my colleague, but because you said Putin is our threat now, and Iran could be another threat in the foreseeable future. The last round of negotiation on the nuclear program of Iran has begun this week, and we are running out of time. In the 30th of June is already very, very fast. What's your views about these ongoing negotiations? And I would precise my question that way. What if the agreement, the final agreement, if we eventually have one, does not provide verification assurances on the possible military dimension of the nuclear program? Should the US sanctions be lifted in such a case? Another question related to this is, do you think President Obama needs so much a deal that he could accept too many concessions on verifications, for instance, or on the right to research and development programs on enrichment, for instance, and to what extent? And would you fear the possibility of an Iranian hedging strategy for the 10 or 20 years to come? Well, sorry, it's a tricky question, but I think it's an important one. Thank you.
Thank you. And you probably know that we have somebody here who wrote a letter to the Iranians. So can actually help out with that quite. Maybe some of you don't. Perhaps he can explain when we come to the answers. And the third question, please, gentleman at the back there.
This is a question particularly to you as legislator.
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself?
Yes, John McCarthy, Australia.
Thank you.
The United States is faced with sort of three areas of real political tension in the world right now. Obviously here, the Middle East and East Asia. Simply on questions of cost, how can you deal with the commitments that all three of you very much wish to honour over the next decade or so? How are you going to manage your budget to deal with these sorts of commitments and potential threats?
Thank you very much. Iran, Senator Cotton, and the American Constitution. Perhaps you might explain. Some people here might not be familiar with the moves that you made earlier in the year, and perhaps also an opportunity to answer the questions on that country.
Sure. Well, I think a nuclear-armed Iran is actually the gravest threat the world faces, and therefore that the United States faces as well. Earlier this year, I wrote a letter that 46 of my Senate colleagues, to include Senators Barrasso and Senator McCain, signed to the leadership of Iran, simply stating that under our constitutional system, while the president may negotiate agreements, the Congress has to approve them for them to be lasting and binding. And all 47 of us expressed that because we don't think that the leadership of Iran was getting the message. Either they weren't getting it in Switzerland or it wasn't being transmitted to them in Tehran. But the risk that these negotiations pose are very grave, because when they started almost 2 years ago, I may have opposed them then, but the stated objectives was to dismantle Iran's nuclear program. No uranium enrichment, no heavy water reactor plant, no underground fortified bunker at Fordo, complete disclosure of the past military dimensions of their work. The statement 2 months ago from our administration, so the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in my opinion, was not a deal. It was not a framework for a deal. It was a list of dangerous concessions that walked back almost every one of those stated objectives. And it wasn't even matched by Iran's corresponding statement. In the past 2 months, we have seen, as I suspected, a continued walking away from other commitments, like the disclosure of the possible military dimensions, like the fact that only nuclear-related sanctions would be released. These are reports that are widely made in the media. If that is the kind of deal that the president presents to us, I certainly will oppose it. I suspect many people in the Congress will oppose it. I suspect there's a real chance that the next president may repudiate it, because it would put Iran on a path to a nuclear weapon. Whether that happens in 11 years, when some of the key provisions of that deal would expire, or whether it happens in the interim because Iran cheats on that deal. And we cannot allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. Just look what they do in the world today. Look what they do in the Middle East in terms of fomenting terrorism, upending governments, the virulent anti-Semitism, the oppression of their own people. Imagine what they would do if they got nuclear weapons, and imagine what they will do just next month if they get up to $150 billion in sanctions relief. They're not going to spend it on hospitals and schools and roads in their country.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Yes, as I brought up the question originally, I believe that the president may be too anxious and too eager for a deal, so then more likely to come up with a bad deal. You want a world where Iran has a nuclear weapon is less safe, less stable, less secure. So you want accountability. You want there to be verifiability. You want it to be able to be enforced. And my worry is that Iran is willing to promise just about anything in one way or another to get the money, but it'll be complicated a deal enough that they'll be able to cheat and pretend that they're not cheating. And my worry is that they're using the money, you know where the money's going to go. Even when some money there was sanction relief to bring Iran to the table and to continue with the negotiations. And we met in Saudi Arabia, John, with some of the freedom fighters who have come in from the Syrian fight. They said that, money has gone from Iran, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to state-sanctioned terrorism. We've seen it with the Houthis as well. So we know that this money is not going to be used for peaceful purposes, but will be used for additional terror to strengthen them, which is why I think that any deal that allows for the money to flow is one that is going to put the world at greater harm. And then this is, as Senator Cotton said, this was supposed to be about stopping Iran, not to enabling Iran, which is the way I believe this is heading right now. So as one senator, I'm going to go through the deal. If the president proposes it, we're going to have 30 days to review it and then vote approval, disapproval. But unlike a treaty, which needs 67 votes in the United States to affirm this is set up for a deal that we can vote disapproval and that the president can then veto that. So then to override his veto, we will need 67 senators to say this is a bad deal. And the president is trying to bet on holding 33 senators to say, well, it's not so bad. And so it's instead of needing 67 votes to approve, we'll only need 33 votes at the end of the day. But as one senator looking at this, I can't imagine that they can come up with something that I would approve at this point.
And just to follow up on that, and any of you could answer this, if you really get a deal which all of you regard as bad, how many of the Democrats will come over to your side of the aisle on that issue?
Well, it's hard to know a count because we don't know what the deal is, obviously. But there are a number of states that have very strong pro-Israel constituencies. And those individuals, of course, like all of us that are elected, respond to our constituencies. Look, I agree with everything my colleague said. I would just refer for your reading an article, editorial that was in the Wall Street Journal about a month and a half ago by Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. It laid it all out. It pointed out that the object of these negotiations were to make sure that Iran never acquired a nuclear weapon. They morphed into now a delay of when Iran would acquire nuclear weapons. And I can assure you that if this kind of deal, as I understand it today, goes through, you will see a nuclear Middle East. I've been told that personally. And if I were sitting in their shoes and saw that it's simply a delay, I would be making the appropriate arrangements as well.
Sorry, when you say you were told that, you mean by senior figures?
They will start on their own nuclear. You will
governments in the Middle East.
Nuclearize the Middle East, yes. And in some cases, that wouldn't take very long. I want to go back to the question here a minute. And by the way, finally on the Iranians. The Iranians are the ones that sent in the copper-tipped IEDs into Iraq that killed hundreds of American soldiers and Marines. The Iranians are the ones that brought Hezbollah into the fight in Syria and bailed out Bashar Assad, who was in the president's word, would be leaving his position of power. It's the Iranians that have backed the Houthis that has overthrown the government of Yemen. It's the Iranians that, as I said, are taking in Syria, and it's the Iranians that are in charge now in Lebanon with their satellite and their proteges, the Hezbollah, and it's the Iranians that are continuing to exert greater and greater influence over the government in Baghdad. So I think, and of course, their development and research and development on both warheads and the means to deliver those warheads continues apace. So I think they even had a plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in a restaurant in Washington. Not a very good restaurant, I might add, but I don't want that to get into. But finally, I just think that these, as we have tried to point out, they're not disconnected. The Chinese went from filling in 60 acres over the last 10 years or so to now filling in 1,000 acres. They're going to build runways and they're putting in weapons. That's not an accident. In the case of Ukraine, you were talking about cost. The Ukrainians are not asking for a single American boot on the ground. They're just asking for weapons that are 21st century weapons to counter 21st century weapons that Putin continues to send into Ukraine. And finally, I think that this treaty or agreement, not a treaty, with Iran will be a seminal moment, particularly in the history of the United States Senate, because in the United States Senate we do have unlimited debate. And I think that the American people, which they don't very often, will be paying attention to the debate that goes on if this agreement is concluded and submitted to the United States Senate, because it is now required for us to voice our approval or disapproval of the sanctions, lifting the sanctions that are congressionally imposed.
Robert,
Please.
I just want to add on the political point, it is hard to predict how anyone in the Senate or the House will vote on any potential deal since we don't know the deal. But Senator McCain is right that the American people are strongly opposed to a nuclear deal with Iran that would put them on the path to a nuclear weapon. Now, the Senate hasn't had a chance to weigh in frequently on the Iran issue because legislation was frequently blocked from coming up. 2 years ago in the House of Representatives on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we passed out a new Iran sanctions bill that then got 400 votes on the House floor. It didn't get a vote in the Senate. But just a few years before that, comprehensive sanctions against Iran was passed unanimously out of the United States Senate. And that's a reflection not only of what the senators and the congressmen think, but what the American people think. It's not just about Israel, but it's about the 35-year war that Iran has been waging against the United States, helping kill our Marines and our diplomats and our intelligence officers in Lebanon, killing hundreds of troops in Iraq in the last decade. So the American people are going to weigh in on this, and anytime the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House has had a chance to vote on something about Iran in the last 5 years, they have voted overwhelmingly to stand up to Iran.
And what sort of message, coming back to where we started, what sort of message, I mean, you've been talking just now about the American constituency, the American voter, how things might pan out in Congress. What sort of influence is coming from this side of the Atlantic over to you? What are you hearing? What do you think they're telling the White House?
We're hearing those that just read the headlines or the lead, that our European friends keep trying to find ways to lift sanctions on Vladimir Putin. That we are in some ways reminiscent of the 1930s. That no one talks about the annexation of an invasion and taking Crimea into Russia, which was guaranteed the territorial integrity as part of the territorial integrity of Ukraine and the Budapest Agreement, where they gave up their nuclear inventory. We're watching attempts, or what seems to be a failure to support the people of the military of Ukraine with some weapons, some opposition to that. So what we are looking at is a Europe that I think needs to be energy independent, which is why we raise this, and we need to have a Europe that will not ignore the lessons of history. If bullies and thugs, particularly those that may have some domestic economic problems, continue to act in an aggressive fashion, and in this case, for the first time in 70 years, a European nation is being dismembered, then we believe that, I guess my word is, we're disappointed.
Is that something you share, Senator Barrasso, as well? Absolutely. Okay, let's go to, it's kind of worrying that there's applause for people being disappointed, but that's perhaps a statement of where we are. I know what you're saying when you're applauding. Okay, the lady there, please.
Christina Eichhorst, I'm with the Adenauer Foundation, Germany. Senator McCain, you said that we won the Cold War, or the battle of ideas and the war against propaganda, also because we had Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. Nowadays we are again confronted with propaganda, with war of ideas, but nowadays we don't have the monopoly of radio anymore, we don't have the monopoly of TV anymore. We discussed this issue quite intensely, how to counter, there is an analysis that is the problem, that we have this propaganda and that we somehow have to address it and that we somehow have to counter it. But in terms of the internet and the variety of information you can get via the internet, it's, from my point of view, really difficult to draw a counter strategy exactly to address this problem. Is there some work going on to address this in the US or to draw a strategy to counter propaganda in the US?
Thank you very much. The gentleman there. Yes.
Thank you. Alain Delettre of Free Day, Brussels. Senators, I'm for one very skeptical when I hear members of the Republican Party speaking the way you just did about nuclear issues in the Middle East. Because the last time you were in power in the United States, you started the war in Iraq. And I'm very happy to see that you follow very closely what Vladimir Putin is doing and saying. And I'm sure it has not escaped from your attention that he quotes George Bush and what he did, and particularly the propaganda of Fox News in 2003, including against allies like Germany and France, which disagreed, as what Russia should be doing, and saying that Russia is not doing worse than that. So the question I have to you is, many allies represented in this room have a lot of trust in what the Obama administration is trying to reach with Iran, a lot of trust in the quality of the American negotiating team. So you, as the great old party, what would you do to make us, your allies, believe in you again when you speak about nuclear issues in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nice and tough. The lady there, please. They can take it.
I'm Shannon Chiesi with the Diplomat magazine. You've described a world where Vladimir Putin and a nuclear Iran are the two greatest threats facing America, and by extension, presumably the two places where America's attention should be focused. What does that mean for the future of Obama's signature foreign policy initiative, the rebalance to Asia, and how much attention can the United States spare for the Asia-Pacific region?
Thank you very much. Senator Cotton, should we start?
Can I just start here? George Bush was the democratically elected leader of a country that liberated a tyranny. Vladimir Putin is a tyrant that invaded a democratic country. That is a fundamental difference. And the Western intelligence agencies all agreed with our intelligence agencies that Saddam Hussein at the time had a nuclear weapons program, had other weapons of mass destruction. That was wrong, but a leader has to make the best decision he can at the time of decision with the information at hand. So we can all learn lessons from that, but that should not impair the trust that the United States has with our allies in Europe.
Senator Barrasso, I mean, do you take the same view?
Because we asked a question about the president's signature global, if you will, foreign policy achievement, and I was waiting to hear what it was, because I had no idea. I think that the president has not done a good job in foreign policy. The reset with Russia, the red line, in Syria, you go one after another, taking abandoning what his military men and women on the ground were saying, and pulling everyone out of Iraq, which allowed for a void. The president said it was a stable, sovereign, self-reliant country, and the next thing you know, ISIS is right there because of the void that was created. So in all of these areas, I've been very concerned and spoken up about the president's foreign policy activities, and how I think it has let us be more vulnerable, because what you do in one place is seen all around the place. It's seen in North Korea, it's seen in Russia, it's seen in China, it's seen no matter where you are globally. And I think that is not that the president's activities have made our enemies fear us less and our friends trust us less. So there is that. The issue that was raised over here with how to go about this, I think most people watch the news in their native tongue, so that we ought to be doing a number of this broadcasting in Russia, in the Russian language. And I know that there's a story in The Economist last week, I think, is it Helsinki is funding efforts to try to do broadcasting and allowing popular program to be used in Estonia and in Russian, so that then they will stay on to the local news. There are just different ways to try to get that out. You are also right that a younger generation is not necessarily turning the television on at all. And you look at the success of ISIS with recruitment, it's the new age media that has been so successful there. But I think assets are being spent on one side and not on the other. And then I think they're being spent on the side of evil. They're by way of Russia, ISIS, putting that effort into media. And we don't have today Radio Free Europe and and the others, and now there is an effort to get that going again. But in the void, we've seen what happens. You see what happens in a void, whether it's a void on the ground in Iraq with ISIS coming in, or a void in the communications, which is, you see, Russia and ISIS, again, successful, and the resources have not been put into there, and they need to.
Could I point out also that young people and now really most people in the world communicate and get their information and knowledge from social networking and the internet more than was the case years ago. I would also point out that all these innovations literally were invented in the United States of America. So the United States of America, using the best minds we have from Silicon Valley and other places of the United States, should be able to come up with a capability of countering this propaganda that's coming out of Russia, and we should be able to do so effectively. And so we really need to shift. In fact, in the bill we just passed, there's emphasis on it. We need to shift our emphasis on countering that message with the truth. And the truth always wins out. What they're being exposed to is lies. So I am convinced that one of our highest priorities is to marshal the best minds we can find in Silicon Valley and have them develop ways of getting the message of freedom, democracy, and all the things we stand for, which will always win if it's a level playing field. And by the way, I am convinced that this is the next battlefield, just as it was during the Cold War. The reason why we didn't have a war was because of radio. How many people came out of then Iron Curtain countries and talked about what happened when they heard Radio Free Europe and all of the other organs that we used to get the message into them. So I agree with you about the challenge, but I am confident if we put our minds to it that we will be able to counter this. But I do accept your statement that they are winning now, particularly in Russian-speaking places. That the war in Iraq, here's a dirty little secret that none of my liberal friends want to admit, my friends. We had the war won. I can show you the facts. I can show you the facts on the ground. Thanks to David Petraeus, after years of mishandling, we started the surge and we won. At great cost of American blood and treasure, the situation was under control. And those of us who saw the complete withdrawal of American troops predicted exactly what was going to happen. Just as we are predicting if we have a complete withdrawal of American and allied troops from Afghanistan, you will see that movie again, and it's a great tragedy. And so we would have had a stable, democratic Iraq if it had not been for the complete withdrawal. The president doesn't seem to realize that just because you leave conflicts, it doesn't mean those conflicts end. Finally, I would just add to that list ISIS. ISIS is recruiting young people from all over the world, and it is a very, very significant threat. And the fact that the perception out there is that they are winning is attracting thousands more. One of our spokesperson the other day said we killed 10,000 ISIS. We used to do that body count during the Vietnam War as well. With those 10,000 been killed, I am sure they have been more than replaced by young men, particularly from Europe as well as other parts of the world.
And Robert, there's an important link between what Senator McCain said about winning in Iraq versus when we were losing, and the question about propaganda. All the tools that have been discussed here, social media, Radio Free Europe, and so forth, are critical tools of national power. But in war, there is no substitute for victory. I was in Iraq in 2006. I heard what our commanding generals and what politicians in Washington were saying about we are winning. That's not what we saw on the front lines. That changed in 2007 and 2008, and we began to win, and no amount of spend could cover that up. If we win in Ukraine, no amount of spend from Vladimir Putin, no amount of money can cover up that fact. But winning in Ukraine is not just about stopping the invasion in eastern Ukraine from advancing or reclaiming Crimea. It's also about helping Ukraine become a Western, capitalist, democratic country. And the people in this room represent countries that can help Ukraine do that. You've traveled down that path in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Estonia. You understand how to grow your economy, how to counteract systemic corruption, how to promote democratic Western values. That's why it is incumbent upon all of us to make sure that Ukraine becomes a Western democratic country. And if they do, no amount of propaganda from Vladimir Putin can change that.
Thank you. That's great, because I wanted to end up, we've got literally a couple of minutes left, but just asking the question, perhaps you can, since you just finished this, again, literally a sentence or two, what do we do regarding Ukraine tomorrow? What's the thing that we do tomorrow? Not the long-term plan, of course, we talked about that. We talked about the strategic vision. What do we do tomorrow?
Two things. Announce we are sending them defensive weapons, and Ukraine takes significant and impactful steps to get rid of corruption.
Senator Barrasso.
Well, that's exactly what we heard. We were there earlier today. You go to eastern Ukraine and you meet the fighters. They are ready to fight, and they fight. And we visited with them directly. They just need the tools to get it done. I think we need to make that announcement.
Exactly that. More broadly, isolate and confront Putin. Stop going to Moscow. Stop inviting him to Europe. We could learn some lessons from that as well. Stop giving him the prestige that he so desperately craves. Isolate him and show him that Europe and the United States stand together in defense of Ukraine.
Could I just make one other thing? I'm optimistic about the United States, our innovation, our energy independence, our manufacturing jobs. I am optimistic about our relationship. I believe that it's important as anything else, that we conclude a free trade agreement. I believe that Trans-Pacific Partnership with Asia, which is in trouble in the Congress right now, I think we'll get through it. That is as important as anything we can do on national defense and national security. And we need to do the same thing in Europe immediately following. You're our best friends. We have a relationship that goes back for so many years. We fought and died and bled together, and it's time we remembered that and began working together against this new challenge.
Well, just before I say thank you to the senators and for everybody here for creating such a great discussion, there are always procedural things. If you're going to a dinner session this evening, be downstairs in the lobby by 6:30 p.m. I thought that was a very rich and enriching discussion, especially you've just come from Kiev. I don't think we could have got better insight into something which is a matter of enormous importance in itself. And as I said, it symbolizes so much else in terms of our values and what we're prepared to do and what we can do. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the Senator's delegation.